Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to this session about the Future Teaching Excellence Framework, also known as the TEF. My name is Graham Rosenberg. At the Office for Students, I'm the head of TEF and Skills Policy. And for those of you who've seen me before, I've been involved in the TEF since it began back in 2016. And I'm delighted to be talking today about the future TEF scheme, having carried out the last assessments back in 2019. And we've since then had an independent review, and internally within the Office for Students, we've been developing proposals for the future TEF alongside development of our approach to regulating quality. This session today is aimed primarily at people who are less familiar with the TEF. So we're going to spend about half the time talking through the main proposals that we're making, and about half the time answering any questions that you have. So it's an opportunity to ask any question you like about the TEF proposals. We're going to structure the session so that we talk through a bit about the background and then go through each of the main areas of the proposals, and we'll pause at the end of each section for questions. So a few notices about how the event will run. Closed captions are available. That's a transcription of what we're saying. Click on the CC icon, but do be aware that it is automated, so there may be some errors. We're recording the session. We will make the recording available as well as the slides on the OFS website, and we'll post a link to that in the chat. Now you can ask questions at any time. We'll try to answer them at the relevant point as we go through the proposals. Use the Q&A box to ask questions, please, rather than the chat box. The chat box can be used if you'd like to speak to the events team, for example, if you have any technical issues with this webinar. We are consulting on the future TEF alongside two linked consultations. One of them is about our approach to regulating student outcomes, and the other consultation is about the indicators that we propose to use both to inform TEF assessments and to inform regulation of student outcomes. So they're all linked consultations. They were published on the same day, they close on the same date, and we're very keen to hear your feedback on all of these proposals. We're running sessions similar to this one on each of those consultations. You can see the dates on your screen. And in addition to those events, we're also very keen to hear from students and student representatives. So we're actually aware that students may be less inclined to submit formal written responses to these consultations. So we're actually running some listening sessions on a number of dates where we're inviting students and student reps to come along and give us feedback on the proposals. So please do pass that on to student representatives at your institution and encourage them to consider taking part in one of those events. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to my colleague, Richard Smith, who is Head of TEF at Office for Skills, who's going to take you through the proposals. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Graham, and really delighted to be here today to talk to you all about the TEF consultation proposals. Really excited that they're out and published, and really very keen to hear what people think of the proposals and what the views are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and the purpose of the TEF, and if we could move on to the next slide, please. Yep. It's really important that we first set out what the purpose of the TEF is and what we want it to achieve, as all of our consultation proposals flow from that. So on this slide, you can see the first bullet sets out that we think that the TEF should incentivize improvement and excellence in teaching and learning and student outcomes. And we want that to be at all universities and colleges, and for it to be a national exercise. So hopefully that's quite straightforward. The second bullet here sets out that we want the TEF to incentivize providers to improve and deliver excellence above our minimum baseline quality requirements and for its mix of students and courses. And that probably requires a little bit more explaining. So it's worth saying the TEF is part of a wider regulatory system that OFS operates. So we look at the sector in terms of performance in relation to what we call the baseline. These are the minimum quality requirements that we regulate in order to protect students and the taxpayer. Now, above these minimum requirements, we use various means, including the TEF, to encourage providers to pursue excellence in their own chosen way. And we have other means for incentivizing providers, such as funding and so forth. And above the baseline, we really want to incentivize providers in their own chosen way, because that allows things like autonomy and diversity across the sector. Now, we want these different parts of our regulation, so regulation at the baseline and regulation above the baseline, to operate in a coherent way. And as Graham said, we've put out a number of consultations at the same time. So we really want to kind of see the connections between them. So we're consulting on the TEF at the same time as we're consulting on our approach to regulating student outcomes and the data that underpins those regulatory functions. Now, this is really important to hold on to as we look through the proposals. So put another way, we wouldn't normally think it was appropriate to recognise providers with TEF awards if we are concerned with issues around baseline compliance. So our proposals carefully draw a distinction between those parts of the regulatory framework that are concerned with the baseline and those parts that are interested with performance above the baseline. So we also set out here in this bullet that we're interested in improvements for the particular mix of students and courses that a provider has. Now, this is really important because it means that with the TEF, we want to take into account the context that a provider operates in. We think this approach means that the TEF will benefit the widest range of students possible. And I hope that you'll see through our proposals that we've sought to design them in such a way that they do work for a broad range of provider types and for different types of higher education courses. Now, it also means that it's possible for all types of higher education provider and providers with very different missions to be recognised as being excellent if they're doing a fantastic job for their students. So it's not simply about being the best overall. A further point that I'd like to bring out here is around equality of opportunity, which, along with protecting and promoting quality, is at the heart of our work here at the Office for Students. And the way we've designed the TEF proposals means that we want providers to have to show excellence across all of their groups of students if they're going to be recognised for those most prestigious outcomes. So the final part of this slide talks about how we envisage TEF ratings being used as the kind of mechanism to drive incentives, putting a spotlight on the quality of providers' courses. And you'll see as we go through the proposals how important transparency and presentation of TEF outcomes is for achieving that. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please. What we've got here is short potted history of the TEF. As Graham said, TEF's been run before. It was originally introduced by the government, who wanted to use the TEF to drive up choice and drive up teaching quality. And it was introduced as what we call a provider level exercise. So the idea was that the early iterations of TEF would lead to a single overall result of either gold, silver or bronze for a university or college. But there was an ambition to move to what we called subject level, and this would be a system that would lead to every subject in a university or college being rated. So as you can see from this slide, provider level assessments were run in the 2016-17-18 academic years, and these exercises had real world outcomes and implications. And you'd have seen these results possibly being reported in the sector press, appearing on student information websites, and being advertised by universities and colleges themselves. These exercises were voluntary, but we did have quite a large take-up from across the sector. The biggest exercise was the 2016-17 run of it, and that saw almost 300 universities and colleges taking part. And around a quarter got a bronze award, around half got silver, and the remaining quarter got gold awards. Now, because we were interested in moving, or the government was interested in moving to subject level TEF, in 2017 and 18, there were a number of pilot exercises that tried out a variety of ways of generating subject level ratings. Now, these approaches were quite experimental, so they didn't lead to real world results, but we did gain an awful lot of learning from them, and a lot of that has fed into our proposals too. Now, Graham already briefly mentioned the independent review, and that's a really important activity that was running in parallel to all of this. So the independent review of TEF was conducted by Dame Shirley Pearce. She conducted a really thorough, wide-ranging review of the exercise that had taken place. She engaged with stakeholders and experts from across the sector, and really explored a number of tensions within the original design of the scheme. and with the help of advisors and an expert statisticians too, tackled issues such as the way data was being presented and used in the exercise. And the result was she formulated a well-received set of recommendations that were published in early 2021, and the government published its response alongside that too. Now, I'm not going to systematically run through all the recommendations that Shirley put forward or the government response, as that would require an event in its own right. But what I would like to do is just draw out a couple of key points. The first is that we've really carefully considered Shirley's proposals and had very careful regard to the government's response in formulating consultation proposals that you can see. So our proposals, though, do necessarily look different from the suggestions and recommendations of the independent review. We've had to balance those suggestions against our legal duties, and we've come to our own views about how the TEF should dovetail with our regulatory activities. But I think what you would find if you mapped our proposals against the suggestions, that there are a number of areas where we've sought to build on or deliver the spirit of what the independent review is suggesting. And I'll note some of those links as we go through the proposals. I think at this point, it's really important to note that one of the key things that the independent review was clear about was the importance of using TEF to incentivise excellence and for there to be greater clarity around how the TEF related to the wider regulatory landscape. The final thing to point out on this slide is, as mentioned, our consultation on the TEF is part of a wider series of changes to our regulation of quality and standards. And we've been consulting on changes to quality and standards in phases since 2020. And most recently, as we've mentioned, in January 2022, same day as the TEF consultation came out, consultation relating to student outcomes. Now, I've mentioned quite a few reports and other consultations, and when you get these slides, there's a slide with links to useful resources, and I think that colleagues have also been putting some of the links up in the chat as I've been going along. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide, please. So before we go into the proposals in a bit more detail, I just wanted to broadly set out how we see the TEF working. And this is actually very similar to how the TEF has run in the past as well. So fundamentally, it's a desk-based exercise. So we have an expert panel that comes together to review evidence about universities and colleges and to make decisions about the ratings they should receive. There are a number of stages. So after this consultation concludes, we'll consider all the responses and make decisions. And following that, we'll draft full specification for the TEF. And we'll also draft and publish tailored guidance for people taking part. So guidance for universities, guidance for students, and also guidance for the panel. And we'll publish these, and we'll also publish data for each provider. And I know that some of you may well have had access to data that we've published alongside these consultations, which are there to help inform you, inform your responses. So once all of this is published, providers and students would have a period of time to prepare submissions. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on in the presentation. And meanwhile, we'll be recruiting and training up a panel of experts to undertake the assessments. They'll come together, review all the evidence, as I say, come to their decisions. Then what will happen is that their provisional decisions will be shared with universities and colleges, and they'll have a chance to make what we call representations before the outcomes are finally published. Again, I'll explain a bit more about that further along. And then, as you could expect, outcomes will be published and promoted. They normally last until the next exercise. However, the data that underpins the TEF, we would look to update on an annual basis. So that's it in terms of the background and purpose of the TEF. Now I'm going to go into the kind of first set of proposals. So if we could have the next slide, please. Next one along. Thank you. So the first section is what we call the kind of framework proposals for the TEF. And these are all around, at a broad level, how we think the TEF should be designed. So our first proposal is around provider level periodic ratings. And this sets out how often we think the TEF exercise should run. And we propose that every 4 years is proportionate. We think that will help keep down burden overall compared to a yearly exercise. It also establishes that TEF should be, as I mentioned before, provider level exercise, so leading to an overall rating for the provider rather than for a rating for each subject in a university or college. I'm just going to pause on this because I think it's important to say that whilst we don't think that an exercise that rates every single subject in a university or college is necessary, we do think it's really important that TEF takes into account information about all the different groups of students across the range of courses and subjects at a university or college. And that was a really key thing that we learned when we piloted at subject level, and also really aligns with the conclusions of the independent review. So our first proposal also notes, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, that the TEF will be about assessing undergraduate teaching. So it's not going to be around assessing postgraduate teaching. The second proposal is around what we call aspects of features and assessment. And so this proposal is really setting out information about what the TEF is interested in assessing. And if we just move on to the next slide, please. This sets out what we're interested in, how it operates, as I say, above the baseline. So what we're interested in is two broad areas that we call aspects. The first is the student experience aspect, and what we're interested in here is the extent to which teaching, learning and assessment in the education environment at a university or college has delivered an excellent academic experience for students. The second aspect is the student outcomes aspect, and here we're interested in how far students succeed in and beyond their studies, and also what we call educational gains. And I want to just pause on educational gains because educational gain is something that the independent review recommended, and I'll have to put it in the context of what we're looking for in student outcomes more broadly. So when considering student outcomes, we'll look at data that measures how well students continue through and how they complete their studies and how many progress into certain jobs, further study or positive outcomes. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail as we go through this presentation. But as well as these kind of numerical outcomes, we think that providers should be able to explain what it intends its students to gain beyond these measures and to provide evidence of how they do that. And this is what we're thinking about when we're talking about educational gains. And we recognise in the consultation that because of the diversity of universities and colleges in the sector, there'll probably be quite different ways of articulating and presenting this. So some of you may be aware that in the past, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, which preceded the Office of Students, ran a programme where it worked with a number of universities and colleges to explore some of the concepts. At the time, they described that as learning gain, but they definitely relate to the concept of educational gain here. Again, we put a link in the slides. I think a colleague has put a link in the chat. So you can go and have a look at some of the things that universities and colleges have done in the past that sought to understand and measure things like knowledge improvement, skills, personal development, and so forth. Now, underpinning the aspects, if you look at the consultation, you'll see that there's an annex that sets out more details around what we think these aspects would cover, and we describe those as features of excellence. The annex also sets out how those features of excellence would kind of differentiate between sort of different levels of performance. So for example, you'd be able to kind of go and look and see how we think the student experience aspect would break down into things like teaching feedback and assessment practice, course content, physical and virtual learning resources, amongst others. Okay, actually, could we pop back to the framework slide, please? Yeah, thank you. So the third proposal is that there'll be a number of ratings categories and that they'll continue to be called gold, silver and bronze, and that they would signify excellence above our baseline quality requirements. And actually, if we could go on to the rating slide, we can see a bit more detail about that. Next one, yeah, great. So this slide sets out a high level, the kind of performance we would expect to see from providers if they were to be awarded a gold or a silver or a bronze. Again, in our consultation, we set out a bit more detail about how providers' performance across the features of excellence I just described would contribute to these different ratings. So, for example, we would expect gold, which is described here as being student experience and outcomes are typically outstanding. When we dig down into the detail of that, we describe that as being that most features of that aspect would be outstanding quality for all groups of students, or that all the features in the aspect would be outstanding for most groups of students. Again, as I say, this slide conveys how we see gold, silver, and bronze as being degrees of excellence. I'll say more about the requires improvement category in a second, because that's around our fourth proposal. But one of the distinctions I want to make again is that there is a distinction between providers that meet our baseline requirements and can take part in the TEF, but there are providers where there might be issues identified in relation to baseline compliance. So there's another kind of category of outcomes where there may be a breach of those minimum requirements. If we could go back to the framework slide, actually. The last one, yeah, thank you. So our fourth proposal is around the fact that where there is absence of excellence in the assessment, we think there shouldn't be a rating awarded, and the published outcome would signal that improvement is required. So that might occur where the panel found that there was no or minimal evidence of very high quality or outstanding features at the provider, or possibly that there were features that were clearly below the level of very high quality and that could be of concern. And the panel considered that that was actually widespread or sufficiently serious to prevent a rating of bronze or above. Now, this could mean that a provider might not be awarded a rating for one or either aspect or the overall aspect. And it's designed to ensure that when we look at the TEF ratings of gold, silver, and bronze, it really does signify that those ratings are associated with excellence. Now, if a provider was, the outcome for a provider was that they had that were identified as requiring improvement, the OFS would consider what to do as part of our regulatory monitoring. And I think another important thing just to flag here is that one of the implications of this proposal is that because it requires improvement categories, not a rating, providers would not qualify for the associated fee uplift that is connected to having a TEF rating. So for example, you would only be able to increase your fee for full-time undergraduate courses from 9,000 to 9,250 if you received a bronze rating or higher. And I think that covers all of the key features of the framework proposal. So I will stop there and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Rich. We've had a couple of questions around these proposals. Firstly, could you say a little bit more about educational gain and whether we have a definition of it, or is it entirely up to providers to define it for themselves?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one we thought carefully about. We're not setting out a specific definition of educational gain. We do think, because of the diversity in the sector, that it is for providers to consider and articulate and think about the best way to evidence that. As I said, there is previous work done around learning gain that providers could look to for a kind of starting point in looking at that. I think there might be another point to make here actually, which is that the way we've pitched the educational gain features in the consultation is more in terms of process than perhaps outcomes. So our features, we are very much interested in understanding the impact of what is happening in a provider. But because we recognize that educational gain may be something that is new to providers, we are kind of looking at more of the processes, understanding the extent to which providers are able to articulate that. We do think that in future TEF exercises, we might become more focused on kind of impact around educational gain, and we might kind of seek to tweak those features in future exercises. So what I could see happening is once we've had one round of the TEF, we will know a lot more about the kind of range of ways in which institutions might choose to measure this, and we could take that learning on board as we develop, as I said, a future TEF one down the line.
Thanks, Rich. There's actually a follow-up question on educational gain, and that's, are we interested only in gains that arise specifically from teaching and learning, or wider gains from other activities like wider experiences, volunteering, skills development, etc.?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we do need to see a line back to teaching and learning here, but we don't rule out the idea that, you know, activities around volunteering learning can lead to important kind of skills development and personal development here. Would be really interested to kind of see the kind of activities that providers might suggest being included here. So if there are specific things people think should be included, you know, do say that in their consultation responses.
Thanks, Rich. Moving on then, is there still going to be a form of provisional award for providers, for example, that don't have enough data to be assessed?
No, we had provisional awards in the previous exercises, as you say, where there was limited data. I'll go on to say a bit more about this, but one of the important things we've sought to do in designing our consultation proposals is to ensure that the balance of data and qualitative information and evidence that might be provided is more appropriately balanced than we think it was in the previous exercise. So we do think that all providers should be able to respond to and articulate a narrative around excellence, regardless of the kind of size they are. So we think that all providers ought to be able to take part in and have the opportunity to get a rating.
Thank you. We've got quite a few questions coming in, just keeping track of those. There's interest in the category of requires improvement, and just wondering if you could say more about why we came up with that terminology. It's clearly similar to Ofsted terminology, and did we think about alternatives?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we think it's very important that the language that the ratings use does create a strong incentive effect. And perhaps I should say that the independent review came up with different names for the ratings, and we did consider those. But ultimately, we did feel that for our proposals, we wanted to see rating names that created strong incentive effects. We think that for the bottom category, we need to be clear to students where it is required, where improvement is required to achieve a bronze or higher. And so that's why we have put what, we understand is clearly a quite kind of strong set of words around that. We do say, though, in the consultation that we would be open to considering the language that's used for the bottom categories. So if respondents are able to propose a set of words for the bottom category that still was clear around the fact that improvement was required, but perhaps using different language, we would very much be interested in that and take that on board.
Thank you. And on a similar topic of the bottom category, if a provider has this outcome, would it last 4 years? Is there any opportunity to reapply?
So we're not proposing to have TEF assessments or exercises in between the 4-yearly cycle. We think that the incentives on providers to improve are well balanced with having a 4-yearly cycle. We think it would be burdensome to run the TEF on an annual basis.
Okay, and on a similar theme, could you say a little bit more about how the absence of excellence relates to our baseline requirements? That probably a number of issues related to that question.
Yes. So where to start with that? So it's important to say that when providers take part in the TEF, we see that they will have gone through the gateway of the baseline. So we're assuming that providers, when they take part in the TEF, meet our minimum baseline requirements. What we're saying though is that to achieve a bronze, silver, or gold, we expect there to be evidence of very high quality performance or outstanding performance, and we clearly want to see kind of clear water between that. So where there isn't that evidence of excellence, we think that there is a category where providers can be above the baseline but not demonstrating excellence. And indeed, there were concerns in the past around how bronze in the previous exercise could interact with kind of those baseline requirements. So we've been quite deliberate here to try and create a space between the baseline and bronze.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, if a provider goes into TEF and comes out with a requires improvement outcome, that means it may or may not meet our baseline requirements, but it wouldn't be the TEF panel making that decision. The TEF panel is essentially concluding that there isn't enough evidence of excellence for a rating. Separately to that, the Office for Students would consider whether there is compliance with the baseline requirements.
Yes.
Okay, which leads nicely into the next question, which is what are the different consequences of getting a requires improvement TEF outcome versus not meeting our baseline requirements?
So if a provider was to not meet our baseline requirements, the OFS would need to have made a decision about that following, a thorough work engaging with the provider through our general monitoring. And you may have seen, for example, in the B3 consultation that we set out how we would prioritize where we'd be looking at providers where we have concerns around baseline. What was the second part of the question? What is the consequence for requires improvement? Yeah, so the consequence for requires improvement, there's a behavioural consequence. We would want to see that providers were improving their provision so that the incentive effect would be that they could move to a bronze in future. The other consequence is, as I mentioned, providers that got an overall rating of overall requires improvement outcome would not have access to the fee uplift, inflationary fee uplift.
Okay, thanks, Rich. We still have a number of questions coming through. I think some of them will pick up in later sections, but for now, will there be any sort of transitional arrangement for newer providers?
Yes, so we do say that if there are newer providers that are coming in where there is not yet the data, that we would look at trying to think of the way we describe it, but we would effectively kind of disapply kind of the requirement.
Okay, thank you. And I think the last one in this section for now, we'll pick some of the others later, but is there any weighting between and within those two aspects?
We'll pick that up in one of the later sections.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for your questions on this. I can see there are a few more. We might pick up some later, but for now, let's move on to the next section, please.
Okay. Okay, thanks, and really good questions. Keep them coming. So the second kind of sets of proposals are all around scope. So we look here at which providers are in scope, and also we go into detail about which courses at universities are in scope. So actually picking up on some of the kind of issues that were underlying some of those questions. For some providers, it's compulsory to take part, and for others, it's voluntary. So it's a requirement to take part if you're registered with the Office for Students in England and have 500 students or more. It's voluntary though for university and colleges that are smaller than that, and also for providers in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So they may take part voluntarily with the consent of the devolved authorities. So we've already said a number of times how we see that TEF operates above the baseline, so it's important that participation in TEF is available only to those universities and colleges that already meet the minimum quality and standards requirements that we regulate, or for the devolved nations, that would be the equivalent kind of arrangements. So what this means is that we'll look into whether providers are eligible to take part in the TEF before the exercise starts, and we'll also look at whether we think they should be able to retain their award. So if there was a breach of baseline requirements, for example, we would likely suspend the TEF award. We also undertake checks to make sure that providers have courses that are in scope for TEF. And so one of the things here is that if a provider has a TEF award but became a postgraduate only provider, it wouldn't be able to keep its TEF award. So that's just one example. So mentioned a number of times that we see TEF as an undergraduate exercise, that it won't cover postgraduates. So it's worth explaining a little bit about what we mean about TEF being an undergraduate exercise. And I think the next slide possibly helps with that. Yeah, so we intend for the TEF to cover all undergraduate courses. So here we're talking about any higher education course that leads to an undergraduate level qualification with any volume of learning, and that's whether or not it's eligible for OFS funding too. And we think that all undergraduate students who are taught with a provider or registered with the provider should be included within that. One thing that we are looking to exclude, though, are those kind of courses at level 5 or 6, where you need a level 5 or 6 qualification as a normal condition of entry. We describe those as kind of postgraduate in time courses, and we're not looking to assess those. Now, for some students of courses, there is limited or no data about them in the TEF indicators. So we have a number of ways of dealing with that. So international students will be in scope for the exercise, but they're not represented, for example, in the progression indicators. So the onus is on the providers to include information about them in their written submissions. There's a couple of other areas of provision: validated only courses, transnational education, and modular or credit bearing courses, where at this point in time there's no data in the TEF indicators either. At this point in time, we'd propose it would be optional for providers to cover such provision in their submissions. But we are intending to explore how we would incorporate these types of students and courses into TEF indicators over time, so that we can achieve the overall aim, which is for all undergraduate provision to be included within the scope of TEF. And I'll pause there again for questions.
Thanks, Rich. Yes, we have a number of questions coming in. I think the first one, there's some related questions about, essentially, could you say a bit more about what we mean by undergraduate level, and does that include, for example, access to HE courses, and does it include higher apprenticeships?
Apprenticeships are included. I'd have to double check, I'm afraid, on the access to HE one. I can't quite remember off the top of my head. Do you know the answer to that one, Graham?
I would answer that by saying we are looking at level 4 and 5 and 6 courses, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay, can you say a bit more about which providers will be required to take part and which ones wouldn't, and how do we calculate the requirement threshold?
Yeah, so as I said, providers are required to take part. I didn't mention it's a condition of registration. It's condition B6, and that sets out that where providers have more than 500 students and are registered in England, they are required to take part. We had a consultation, can't quite remember when it was, that set out how we would calculate student numbers for various purposes. And what we're intending to do is publish information around the numbers of undergraduate students. So I think that's going to be later this month, which providers will be able to use to see if they meet that threshold or not.
Okay. Thank you. So following on from that, there's some questions about the link to fee levels. So if a provider with less than 500 students chooses not to take part, but has an approved access and participation plan, can it still charge the higher fee approved in the APP?
So to have access to the fee increase, the nine, for example, for full-time undergraduate of 9,250, you would have to have a higher quality rating that's set out in legislation. So you would have to take part in the TEF. If you chose not to take part in the TEF, you wouldn't have access to the higher fees.
I think it may just be worth clarifying that there's the £9,000 higher fee from access and participation plans, and it's the extra £250,
yes,
which requires a TEF rating.
Yeah, so similarly, there is a lower fee of £6,000. There's a similar inflationary increase on that fee. If you wanted the fee increase at the 6,000 level, you'd have to take part in the TEF again.
Okay, thanks, Rich. There are a few more questions around exactly which courses are in scope or not. So, for example, does undergraduate include integrated masters? And are foundation years as part of a degree included?
I'm wondering if Alison, if there's a broader answer to some of these that Alison might jump in on.
Okay, so yes, my colleague Alison Brunt, who is head of institutional performance measures and is responsible for the indicators essentially. I wonder if you could give a slightly broader definition of undergraduate that addresses these questions.
Absolutely, thanks, Graham. So as you've already indicated, Graham, we are including in scope here undergraduate courses at level 4, level 5 or level 6. Now that does include provision that is effectively undergraduate in terms of the integrated masters provision. It is not including the provision that is equivalent to level 3. So the access courses that were previously mentioned and other equivalents. But if it's level 4, level 5 or level 6, regardless of who's funding it and regardless of the kind of qualification aim within that, then it will be in scope. So that does include the foundation years that are integrated into a broader degree programme.
Thank you, Alison. I'm just seeing if there are any other questions we haven't covered. There are quite a few detailed questions about exactly what courses are in scope. I think we won't go through all of them now. I think the easiest way to find out is if you have a look at the data that is being shared with each provider. This is data that is based on all the proposals we're making. You can see exactly which of your students and which courses are included or not. Okay, so I think there was one other question about essentially scope and eligibility, and that is, will a provider that doesn't meet the B3 student outcome thresholds lose their TEF award?
So it's worth saying with B3 that there will be a kind of wider process where, and I mentioned this already, where they will look at the data and prioritize those cases that they want to investigate further. Simply having data below a B3 threshold isn't considered in and of itself to be a breach of the baseline. So we need to understand the broader context around that. So what we are proposing is that it would only be where there is a decision that a breach has been made around B3 where there would be an impact on the TEF outcome. So if a provider was in breach of B3 before the TEF exercise took place, then we would take that into consideration when deciding whether the provider could take part or not. And if a provider already had a TEF rating and there was a subsequent breach of B3, we would likely suspend the TEF award.
Okay, thanks, Rich. I'll take one more question in this section before we move on, and that is, I think, one for Alison, actually, which is about how we count the 500 students where there are only taught students essentially being taught through some contractual arrangements but are not actually registered with the provider. Would that provider have to take part in TEF?
Okay, so we are proposing to calculate the 500 students eligibility criteria for TEF purposes in the same way that the OFS is already calculating student numbers for the purposes of understanding registration fees and for purposes like degree awarding powers and university title applications. So that means that we are looking at students in FTE terms, so counting their equivalents in intensity of study rather than headcount. It also means that we are looking at them on the basis of registered students at a provider rather than taught or subcontracted in.
Okay, thank you. So if you only have taught students, but more than 500 of them, it's essentially voluntary to take part. Thank you. Should we move on to the next section?
Okay, thank you. So the next series of proposals are all around evidence. So provider submissions, student submissions, and indicators. And in terms of the provider submissions, this may be familiar to people from previous exercises. We're asking the providers who are taking part to submit evidence of excellence in relation to the experience of their students and the outcomes of their students. So what we want this to be is really kind of taking providers' own evidence as well as looking at the indicators. And we would hope that providers undertake effectively a kind of self-evaluation of the student experience and outcomes. It would be over the 4 previous years, and it would take into consideration or relate to the features of excellence that I described earlier. We're proposing that there should be a page limit of 20 pages. Now that's actually an increase on previous exercises, and it recognises that there is more data to look at, and also that things like educational gains form a bigger part of the framework. We'll provide a basic template, and we'll be encouraging submissions to be quite methodical in demonstrating the impact and effectiveness of activities or strategies or interventions. And we provide some additional kind of information around that, again, in annexes to the consultation. We also set out that we'll want to be able to verify the information in submissions, and again, there's some information around that. Now, one of the important things to say here is that, as I mentioned earlier, we do see that there is a kind of rebalancing between the submissions and the data sides of the evidence. So one of the reasons we want to be able to do things like verify the information and are encouraging providers to be methodical in demonstrating impact is because we want to be able to take robust decisions using that information. So if we're placing more weight on submissions, then we want them to kind of have really kind of good evidence within them. Student submissions. So for the first time in the TEF, we're proposing that there should be an independent student submission. It would be optional, and we think that it's a really good opportunity for students to contribute to the evidence base. It's worth saying that it's a single submission for students for each provider, so it's not multiple student submissions for the provider. And we think it will provide really important additional insights to the views of students. The scope would be aligned with the provider submission in terms of the student's courses and time frame it covers. Now, to keep the burden down, we're proposing a shorter page limit for students of 10 pages. And we're also really interested to understand how we can maximize this opportunity. So we will also be running a kind of program of engagement with students both before and during the submission window. And we'd be really interested in views from providers on how to make that successful too, especially recognizing that in some parts of the sector there may not be as well established student representation mechanisms and so forth. Okay, so the third kind of leg of this is around indicators. And we say here the OFS should produce numerical indicators based on the National Student Survey responses, student outcomes indicators, and define those consistently with the indicators proposed for the regulation of student outcomes in condition B3. And that we would look at performance in relation to benchmark for TEF purposes. Now, the detail of how these indicators are constructed is the topic of one of the accompanying consultations. There's a separate webinar on that. As we've mentioned, indicators have been released to providers based on the proposals, so constructed based on these proposals. So at least some of you, I hope, will have had access to those and been able to start digging through the data, digging through the presentations. There's a few things from a TEF perspective we want to pick out here. So if we could just move on to the next slide. So the actual indicators that we're proposing to use in the TEF are split between the student experience aspect and the student outcomes aspect. Now, on the student experience side, as mentioned, we're looking at drawing from the National Student Survey, and there are a number of scales that we think align well with the features of excellence that we describe. So we're looking at the teaching on my course, assessment and feedback, academic support, learning resources, and student voice. And we'll look at the kind of positive responses to that when we construct the measure. So we'll be looking at the proportion of strongly agree and agree responses when presenting that. On the student outcomes side, we've got continuation, completion, and progression. Continuation, we'll be looking at percentage of students continuing in their studies. In terms of completion, we've actually got two potential approaches for that, and we're consulting on those two possible approaches through the indicators consultation. And the progression, which draws on the graduate outcomes survey, will look at the percentage of students progressing to managerial, professional employment, or further study. And if we could just move on to the next, actually, no, sorry, if we could stay on that first slide a second. The thing I wanted to say is that when we present the indicators, we'll present them separately for different modes of study. So you'll see the indicators for full-time, part-time, and apprenticeships. And then we'll also present the data for the total undergraduate population, so including all levels, all 4 years of data, and all students taught or registered in the provider. So you see that at the kind of top level. And then if we could move on to the next slide, we will also break down the indicators into what we call split indicators. And this is where we get into some really kind of interesting detail here. But it's worth saying the reason we present split indicators is there are a couple of reasons around it. Firstly is part of our commitment to equality of opportunity. So you'll see that by splitting the data down, you'll be able to understand the performance for different groups of students, and we hope very much that providers would use that information to inform their activities. More broadly, it gives providers a detailed view of their performance, allows them to understand their strengths and weaknesses. And so linking back to the provider submission, we would be looking to see providers really interrogating their data and understanding it and making kind of really considered responses to how they were going to deal with weaknesses and, you know, identifying their strengths in their narratives too. The other reason we split the indicators is, of course, it will allow the panel, when making their assessments, to understand performance, and they'll be able to make decisions and judge whether the provider has undertaken that process of identifying areas for improvement and whether they've targeted interventions appropriately. If we could move on to the next slide, it's important to talk a bit about how we present and interpret the data. And I will explain this slide in a second, but I also want to talk a little bit about what we call benchmarking and also statistical uncertainty. So we think benchmarking is really important, and to explain what it is, it's a well-established technique that we use to provide an indication of how well a provider has performed compared to the performance of similar types of students on similar types of courses in higher education across the sector as a whole. So put simply, it means that where it's appropriate to do so, we take into account a variety of factors in presenting the data. So we look at things like subject of study, personal characteristics, and also things like entry qualifications. Now, the factors we choose to benchmark against for each individual indicator are very important part of the picture. It's not possible to benchmark against absolutely everything because of the way the benchmarking methodology works. So we've made a number of proposals about which factors should be prioritized in the benchmarking methodology. And you can see that as part of the indicators consultation too. But broadly, the kind of key point here is that we think that for the purposes of TEF, using benchmarking remains the most effective way of interpreting the indicators when assessing different degrees of excellence for the mix of students and courses in each provider. So in this diagram, you can see 4 indicators. Now, the top indicator identifies that the provider's performance is close to its benchmark. So you can see it's about a 0.5 percentage point below its benchmark. What we've done is we've used shaded bars to illustrate the range of statistical uncertainty. So you can see here that there's a narrow bar and that we can be relatively, or actually quite confident here, that performance here could be interpreted as being on benchmark. So in other words, the provider's students are doing as well as other similar students in the sector. If you compare that to the bottom bar, you'll see that again, performance is close to benchmark, a touch over, but there's much less certainty in this. The statistical uncertainty that is being represented here is greater than in the first indicator. And if you look at the second indicator, you can see that the provider's performance is actually about 4 percentage points below its benchmark. There's a range of uncertainty, but we can be reasonably confident that it's below benchmark. It's perhaps important to say a little bit more about why we're doing this and actually what the indicators don't include. Now, in the previous TEF exercises, there was a really kind of formulaic way of combining performance in the indicators. And you may have heard terms like flagging or initial hypothesis before, where essentially we put a score on each indicator based on the difference from benchmark and kind of added that up. And that was used as an indicator of whether a provider should be bronze, silver, or gold. Now, this was identified by the independent review as being, a blunt instrument, and there were a number of underlying statistical concerns with that. It introduced significant cliff edges into the process that were quite hard to overcome. Now, we've done away with all of that and hope that this presentation is much more nuanced. So we still, as you can see, report where a provider is in terms of their actual performance and how it relates to the benchmark, but we nuance this by illustrating the range of statistical uncertainty that relates to that information. And we hope that, panels will be able to make more nuanced decisions based on this information than in the past. And I think that's the last slide for this section. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Rich. As you can imagine, we've had lots of questions coming in, especially about the indicators. But before we go on to that, let's start with some questions about the student submission.
Yeah.
So firstly, could you say a bit more about the timeline for student submissions, and does it take into account students being busy with exams or the handover of elected sabbaticals?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. So I've got a slide at the end actually that sets out the timeline more generally, but we will be, subject to this consultation, intending to publish the guidance for students in September so that they could start writing their submissions over the autumn. Now, we recognise that yes, this will interact with the kind of changeover points for student representatives, and we will encourage providers to kind of put plans in place for continuity around that. Of course, if we'll be very interested, one of the proposals is around the timeline, so we'll be interested to hear what people think about whether there are issues that can't be mitigated around, you know, student involvement in this timeline. We are proposing that we'll put in place what's called a kind of a TEF student contact, who would be responsible for coordinating the response across the student body. And we'd work very closely with that student, and we'd hope that providers would support that student really well, student representative really well, to put submissions forward. I think we will be, you know, really interested to understand ways in which we can support those student contacts to engage effectively with their wider student bodies, taking on board, you know, some of the concerns that we've just heard about in terms of exam periods and so forth.
Thanks. And related to that, could you say any more about the kind of support we might offer to student contacts, given that we say it's largely up to them to determine the evidence, and whether there'll be any tools or questionnaires or templates for them to use?
That's a really interesting question. We were certainly thinking that we would run a number of events. We would provide guidance that talked about you know, ways in which they could gather different types of information from the student body. Also look to work with students to understand how they can marshal evidence that perhaps they generate through existing student representation processes and existing kind of ways that they engage with quality processes in their providers. The idea of providing specific templates and tools is an interesting one. I certainly think that there will be a diversity of student representation and a diversity of ways in which they might want to capture evidence. So I'd be slightly concerned that if we put too many things like that in place, it might kind of narrow down the way in which they wanted to articulate things. But I think that's one that we might take away and have a think about, and we could very well, you know, we could engage with students as well to take their views on that.
Thanks, Rich. A few questions around, you may say more about this later, but a few questions around the balance of evidence between the indicators and the submissions, and following on from that, how much weight would be given to the indicators if they don't cover all of the undergraduate students, for example, where certain courses are not covered by the NSS?
Yeah, I was going to say a little bit about this later. There's I'll say it now. There's again, I think I mentioned earlier that one of the key things that ran through a number of the independent review recommendations was around kind of rebalancing submissions and data. And whilst we've not necessarily followed the way the independent review thought to do this, it is built into our proposals. So we say that the indicators shouldn't form more than kind of half of the evidence when weighting judgments. But we very much see that as a kind of principles based, as a principle. So we don't want to get into a situation where we're saying you should weight this as 30% or this as 40% and take this into account as 20% of your overall decision. It's much more important that the panel comes to a rounded view of the evidence that it has before it, whether that's through the provider submission, the student submission, or the indicators. They need to come to a reasoned decision across the information about how they think that relates to the ratings criteria and whether providers should get gold, silver, or bronze. And you know, there'll very much be an onus on the panel to then articulate the reasoning and how they've come to weight particular different pieces of information in their overall judgments. So I think that's the really important point to hold on to, is the kind of principles-based approach, and allowing the panel to deploy its expertise and make expert judgments. And I'll say a bit more about that in due course.
Okay, thanks. But there's a follow-up to this, which is that what if a provider, if a provider's indicators are not reportable at all, but it still wants to take part in the TEF?
Yeah, so that runs actually into one of the things we were talking earlier a bit about provisional awards. Because we've sought to rebalance data versus submissions, we want to have a process whereby anyone can take part regardless of the size of the provider. We do have mechanisms in place that, say that for smaller providers you don't have to take part, and that's kind of one of our considerations in terms of thinking about burden. However, we do think that if you're a smaller provider, you should be able to articulate through your submission how you are achieving a good experience or good outcomes for your students. And if the indicators aren't there for smaller providers, we think that the submission is the place for them to make up that evidence. So we do want to see small providers fully able to take part in the process.
Okay, thanks, Rich. And that evidence could, of course, include any internal surveys, student surveys that the provider runs. So some questions then about the progression indicator. Could you say a bit more what's meant by managerial or professional employment? Does it relate in any way to salaries or income?
It doesn't. Okay, yeah. So again, Alison might want to chip in here, but what we do is we use the standard occupational classification and do a mapping of that to identify what we take to be managerial level occupations. And I think we provide quite a bit of detail around that in the indicators consultation, including some of the types of occupation where it's difficult actually to identify precisely where they should fall, above or below the line. I think the important point here is that there will be cases where there may well be positive outcomes that aren't captured in graduate outcomes for any particular reason, and we would look for providers to explain that in their submissions. I anticipate that people will talk about things like creative arts in this space, and of course what we'll have is panelists who are experts in those industries and parts of the sector too, so they'll be able to understand whether the narrative and the rationales for why these are positive outcomes are appropriate or not, and make an appropriate decision when forming a rating judgment.
Okay, thank you, Rich. There are actually a number of quite detailed questions about the indicators, and given the time, I would suggest that you could take part in the additional webinar on the indicators that will be more focused on that. And of course, there's plenty more material about the indicators to have a look at. So I don't think we've got time to cover all of those questions. I would like, though, to move on to the next section so we can cover all of the proposals.
Okay, thanks, Graham. So yeah, we picked up on some of this already just in the Q&A there, that the TEF we see as a process of expert review, and proposal 10 covers off a few of the details around that. So we'll be recruiting experts from the sector, and I think it's worth saying too that the kind of peer review sector expertise aspect of the assessment was something that was really identified as a strength in previous runs of the TEF, highlighted by the independent review as a strength. So the panel itself would be made up of both academic members from the sector and members who were students or student representatives, and it would be led by Professor Sir Chris Husbands. He'd be the chair of the panel. He's the Vice Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam, and he'll be continuing in the role, having kind of expertly steered the previous TEF panel. We'll also appoint 2 deputy chairs, 1 student and 1 academic, and we'll seek to ensure that the panel has experience of diverse types of provision and that individual members are from diverse backgrounds. Now, we'll work closely with the panel to train them and to make sure that the decisions that they reach are thoroughly considered and robust and credible. And the consultation goes into some details around how we think the panel will be structured and how the panel will progress through decision making. I mentioned right at the start that there is going to be a representations process, and that's set out in Proposal 10.2. Now, what this entails is that the OFS will provide a window of 28 days for providers once they've seen a provisional decision from the panel. So the panel will come together, make provisional decisions, we'll provide those to, we'll send those out to providers, and they'll have 28 days to essentially make a case to us if they think that there are kind of further issues that need consideration, or if there are factual inaccuracies in any of the information that we put back to them. And it would only be after that that providers, once they'd had that opportunity, that we would look to publish the ratings. Now, this is worth kind of flagging because it differs to previous exercises where we instead ran an appeals process that happened after all the ratings had been published. Okay, so Proposal 11 sets out some details about how the panel should interpret and weigh up evidence. And I've already talked quite a bit about this being a principles-based process rather than being overly prescriptive. If we could have a look at the next slide, I'll just run through a few of those. So we've talked about the fact that we want the assessment to consider how far a provider delivers excellence for its mix of students and courses. And we really think that this is one of the ways that will ensure that excellence can be seen across the diversity of the sector. We've also talked a lot about looking at excellence above the baseline, and this links very much to a number of points that we've already made about TEF operating above the baseline. Assessment should be based on a balanced consideration of the sources of evidence. I think I talked about that in the Q&A, so I won't repeat points here, but just to kind of re-emphasize the fact that we're recruiting an expert panel so that they can take nuanced expert decisions and take holistic views across a range of evidence, and we think that that's a really, really positive thing. Next point here is that the ratings criteria should be applied holistically to all the evidence. The point here, I think, is that we don't want to see a tick box exercise, actually. We don't want to see the panel just looking through the list of features and ticking off whether a provider has put forward evidence around that. Rather, we want to be able to look across the breadth of evidence that's been put forward in determining a rating. The final point here about assessments and outcomes being transparent and coherent. As I've mentioned already, we'll publish guidance for panelists so that all parties can see the precise kind of steps that they'll take to reach their decisions. So, providers, universities and colleges will be able to look at that too. In terms of coherence, that relates to how the aspect ratings combine to form an overall rating. And actually, this is one area where we do have some broad rules. Now, essentially what we're saying is that where the aspect ratings differ, the panel would have a choice. They would have to consider what overall rating to give. But we are saying that they should only ever go one higher than the lowest rating. So they could either give the overall rating as being the same as the lowest rating or one higher. To give an example of what I mean here, if the outcome was that there was one bronze aspect and one gold aspect, then we would say that the panel could only award either a bronze or a silver rating overall based on their expert judgment. Maybe also worth saying that this proposal overall also sets out a number of places where the panel would be guided to put limits on the overall rating, and that links back to things like the absence of evidence as described in the earlier proposals. And I'll pause there again.
Okay, thanks, Rich. I only had a couple of questions on this section. First one is about how will we go about recruiting and selecting the panel members?
Yep, so there's already a lot of work going into thinking about recruitment and selection. We will have a campaign So we will advertise for those members, and we will really kind of work with various channels to try and get those opportunities really widely distributed, particularly around students, and also particularly around colleagues from particular parts of the sector. So, for example, we'll be really keen to make sure we have good representation from colleges and providers who are, from who are from kind of private or independent parts of the sector too. And so we'll be thinking about how we can get into those networks. We appoint the panel as a committee of the Office for Students. So we will go through a process of a standard kind of recruitment process, but we will make decisions as the OFS on who ultimately is on the panel. In doing so, we will look to ensure that as far as possible we have good representation of different sort of provider types and location, and also good representation in terms of the diversity of the individuals taking part as well. And I think that's really important because it should reflect the diversity of the sector that we're assessing too.
Okay, thanks, Rich. And a follow-up to that is around how we would train and prepare the panel members in what is a fairly restricted timeline.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying we've got quite a bit of experience now of bringing panel members on board and training them, and we will look to that previous experience. But we'll have guidance, we'll have face-to-face engagement and training sessions, and the training will be, across all things in terms of making decisions, but also some things like, for example, students, we may well put in place training to enable them to understand how to chair meetings and so forth. That's been quite helpful in the past. We'll probably want to do things like diversity training as well. So we'll take those responsibilities very, very seriously. We'll also undertake exercises where we calibrate the panelists' decision making too. So we'll use data and submissions to kind of do dummy runs of the assessment to try and get people consistently applying the specification and applying the rules of assessment effectively.
Okay, thanks, Rich. And I think the last question in this section, unless more come in, is about do we have any idea of the number of panel members and whether it would cover all nations across the UK?
Yeah, so on the latter, yes, we will look to recruit from across the UK. In terms of the numbers, we do have different models in mind, and again, we've got quite a bit of experience of running these types of panel processes now. But I think the important thing to say is we need to see what the responses to the consultation are before we kind of finalise some of these processes. But broadly speaking, in the past, I can't remember the exact number of panelists we had in year two, but I think it was in the realms of 30 to 40 panelists supported by a greater number of what we called assessors. So there was probably around 100 of people involved. We're not proposing to have assessors this time, we're proposing to have just panelists. And we are, behind the scenes, we're looking at kind of efficiencies in the decision, in the timelines, so that we can deliver things on time. But I would expect that it would be a kind of similar number, kind of maybe 75 to 100. It will also depend, of course, possibly on the number of providers that choose to take part.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Rich. So let's move on now to the final section. Yeah.
Okay, so here we're looking around outcomes and implementation. Hopefully not too much to cover here, but I mentioned that we're seeking to ensure that the process is transparent overall, and our proposals in the consultation set out our intention to publish not only the ratings, but the evidence and the data that underpin them. And it also explains how the information will be made available on the OFS register, and that there'll be linked information through the Discover Uni, and we'll work with UCAS as well to understand how we can put information on their pages. One issue that we've identified and we're inviting views on is, as I've mentioned, there's a representations process. Now we need to balance that representations process against the fact that, you know, it's in the public interest to get outcomes out as soon as possible. So because there's a representations process, some providers may have their outcomes confirmed at a later date. And so we've set out some options about how that might be handled in terms of public communications. Our 13th proposal sets out that we don't require providers to publicise their ratings. So if they don't wish to, they don't have to. It will all be publicly available, as I've just said, through OFS and some of those provisional information sites. But where providers do want to publish their information, there'll be a number of kind of rules and regulations around that. And that's because we don't want ratings to be misleading. So imagine again a provider that had a bronze and a gold aspect rating, but was silver overall, for example. We wouldn't want them to only publicise the gold aspect rating. Okay, the final couple of proposals then. First one covers the fact that we want to revert the name of the scheme back to the Teaching Excellence Framework. It's formerly been the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes Framework for a number of years. You know, we set out our reasons, but we want to just revert it back to the simpler Teaching Excellence Framework. We also set out an implementation timeline. Now, we think it's in the best interest of students to get going as soon as possible with the next TEF. We have balanced this against, you know, considerations of burden on providers. And we've also thought quite carefully about whether there's an ongoing impact of the pandemic that we need to account for. But we do think the timeline that we propose offers a balance here. And if we go on to the next slide, yes, you can see here that key things here is that we would anticipate publishing information in order to open a submission window in September. We'd then see the TEF panel carrying out its assessments through November into March 2023, and then, you know, decisions coming out from May 2023 after the kind of first representations come through. And I think that's it. Any more questions then? Yeah.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, we've got a few questions. So firstly, how could students be involved in what the scheme is called?
We'd love to have more suggestions for what the scheme is called. I can assure you we've thought of lots of different ideas. It's worth mentioning that the independent review put forward a name of Educational Excellence Framework as well. So there have been other options put forward, but if there are other good suggestions forthcoming, we'll certainly consider them. We do think, though, that there is an element of brand recognition with this, that it would be sensible to continue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There were a few questions about the timeline, which I think came up earlier. So you've shown a timeline now, so hopefully those have been clarified. Could you say a little bit more about the panel's written statement and what kind of feedback that would be giving to the provider?
Yeah, so a couple of points here. So as I've mentioned a number of times, you know, we want the panel to really considerately weigh up different evidence. So look at the submissions, look at the data, and it will be incumbent on the panel then to articulate a reasoned explanation in the written panel statement for how it's come to its decisions. So that should be a really valuable kind of source of information. We do think that the written statement also would, you know, highlight features that they'd identified where they thought it was particularly outstanding. Similarly, they might kind of get into areas where they were, you know, less convinced, or they thought the performance was poorer. So we do think that these will be a really useful document for providers as well. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Rich. And I think probably our last question, we're also consulting on regulating student outcomes and have consulted on regulation of other B conditions. So if there are decisions being made on breaches of any of those quality conditions, that could be perhaps during the TEF submission window or during the assessment taking place. So could you just say a little bit about how that timing would work?
So if I've understood the question, is that it's basically saying if we identify that a provider's in breach during the submission window, what would we do? Well, I think our starting point is that we would likely to say that they're not eligible to take part, and we might look to see what the impact of that was. But I think it is important to say that whilst that's the likely outcome, we can envisage scenarios where it's not quite as straightforward as that. So a breach could be very time limited, for example. So I think we would have to take context specific decisions about exactly what to do in particular scenarios. And we would engage with the provider when we made those decisions.
Thanks, Rich. But yes, I think also more generally, we're looking at TEF as a periodic exercise taking place every 4 years. Our monitoring of ongoing quality conditions of registration is continuous, and a breach could happen at any point before, during, or after a TEF assessment. And it is at the point when we take a decision about a breach that we may then decide to suspend the provider's eligibility for TEF. So it could be at any point in the process. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for your questions. I'm very conscious that we didn't manage to answer all of them. If we could just move on to the final slide then. If you have questions that went unanswered, please do send them in. There's an email address there to send any questions about TEF. We hope you found this event useful. I certainly found the questions very useful. If you have any feedback on the event, we're really interested to hear it. Some of you will have been asked in advance, but even if not, you can send your comments to the email address that is there. And with that, I would just like to say that we're really looking forward to your responses to the consultation, to the TEF and the other consultations. We look forward to that, and thank you very much for taking part. And with that, I shall say goodbye and thank you very much.